A few weeks ago, I reviewed the new Sigma 16mm f1.4 for EF-M mount cameras. In that review, I mentioned that the 16mm was one of 3 new prime EF-M lenses from Sigma. A few people left comments and sent messages asking about those additional lenses. So, this week, I'm reviewing one of them, the new Sigma EF-M 30mm f1.4. Now, what makes this 30mm Sigma lens an interesting lens to review is the fact that, unlike the aforementioned 16mm, it has competition from another prime EF-M lens with the same maximum aperture and nearly the same focal length. That lens is the Canon EF-M 32mm f1.4. 2 very similar lenses, comparable price, identical maximum aperture, and nearly the same focal length. But which EF-M lens is the better buy for photography and video? Are these lenses any better than the kit lens you may currently be using? Well, today we are going to find out. How's it going, everyone? My name is Todd Dominy. I make videos about landscape photography, gear, and photo processing here on YouTube. First, with these lenses, let's cover all the basics. At the time of this video, the Sigma 30mm retails for $339. Incidentally, this same lens for Sony E and Micro Four Thirds cameras retails for $50 less at $289. Perhaps once the EF-M mount version of this lens is on the market longer, we'll see its price drop to the same level. But for now, it retails for $339 in the United States. As for the Canon 32mm, it currently retails for $429. That makes this lens almost $100 more than the Sigma. The Sigma 30mm weighs in at 9.4 ounces or 265 grams, while the Canon 32mm is about an ounce lighter, weighing in at 8.3 ounces or 235 grams. As far as length goes, the Sigma 30mm is 2.89 inches or 73.3 millimeters, while the Canon is a relatively shorter 2.22 inches or 56.5 millimeters. If you want to attach a circular filter to the front like an ND or a polarizer, the filter thread on the Sigma is 52 millimeters, while the Canon uses a smaller 43. Overall, that makes the Canon 32mm smaller and lighter than the Sigma. Both are prime lenses, which means they have a fixed focal length, so you can only zoom using your feet. The Sigma has a focal length of 30 millimeters, while the Canon uses 32 millimeters. Both lenses are designed for cameras with crop sensors, so if you visualize focal length in terms of full frame 35 millimeter like I do, the full frame focal length equivalency of the Sigma is 48 millimeters, while the Canon is 51. What this means, in case you're not sure what I'm talking about, is that a photo captured using this 32mm lens on a crop sensor camera like the Canon M50 will have about the same field of view as a photo captured using a 50mm lens on a full-frame DSLR. For that reason, both lenses may be described as normal, natural, or standard because their focal lengths closely resemble the field of view of the human eye. Which means these lenses are appropriate for just about everything, including street photography, travel photography, and especially portraits, for their focal lengths don't distort facial features like wide-angle lenses. What these lenses are not appropriate for, however, is vlogging. Their focal lengths are just way too long. For vlogging, you'd be better off using the Sigma 16mm or the Canon 11 to 22mm if you are looking for an EF-M mount lens. Both of those lenses I reviewed in a separate video, which I'll link to up here. So, is there any notable difference between the focal lengths of 30mm and 32? Not really. The Sigma 30mm is just a touch wider than the Canon 32, but it's not enough of a difference to declare one as being better than the other. Overall, the focal length of these lenses create natural-looking photos and videos which embody that classic 50mm field of view. Both lenses have the same maximum aperture of f1.4. That large aperture is fantastic for shooting photos and videos in low light environments, for more light can reach the camera sensor with these lenses compared to a kit lens like this Canon 15 to 45mm. More light entering the lens means faster shutter speeds and/or lower ISO values for clearer, sharper photos and videos. That makes lenses like these ideal for shooting indoors at weddings, birthday parties, or sporting events, for they can support faster shutter speeds without having to dramatically raise the camera's ISO. Let's take a look at a couple of examples to illustrate this point. This is my daughter Sophia, by the way. Thank you, Sophia, for putting up with me. For these photos, I used a single key light set to a color temperature of 5600 Kelvin. This raw, straight out of camera image was shot using the Sigma 30mm set to f1.4 with a shutter speed of 1/80th of a second to help freeze motion. With these settings, the Canon M50 automatically set ISO to 160 in order to get a proper exposure. Now, here is the same image shot using the Canon 32mm. Same aperture, same ISO, same shutter speed. The image quality is nice with both lenses, but the thing to pay attention to here in this low light test is shutter speed and ISO. Wide open at f1.4, both of these lenses can achieve a respectable shutter speed of 1/80th of a second without going above ISO 160. That low ISO value pretty much eliminates any unwanted noise in both images. Now, to demonstrate how impressive this is, let's try something interesting and create a third image using a variable zoom kit lens, the aforementioned Canon EF-M 15 to 45mm. This is the lens which came with my Canon M50, and I would assume many people watching this video probably own and use it as well. The 15 to 45 kit lens doesn't have a large aperture, so the best ISO value it can achieve in this test is 1600. What effect does that difference in ISO have? Well, let's zoom in and take a closer look. The bokeh background of the Sigma and Canon lenses is perfectly smooth and clear, while the Canon 15 to 45mm at far right is noisy and grainy by comparison. So in summary, both the Sigma 30mm and Canon 32mm perform very well in low light, which is especially helpful for crop sensor cameras like the Canon M50. Color and contrast produced by one lens will look different from another, even if both use the exact same camera with the exact same focal length and exposure settings. It's one of the more fascinating things to look for when comparing lenses. To compare, let's go back and look at the same images from before. To my eyes, the raw image produced by the Canon lens on the right is warmer than the Sigma on the left. The Canon lens leans more towards yellow. The Sigma, on the other hand, is comparatively cooler with perhaps a bit more magenta in the mix. This leads me to think that the Canon lens may have been intentionally engineered and optimized for skin tones. And by the way, in case you're curious, these raw images were imported to Lightroom using both the standard Adobe Color profile and a custom camera profile created using this X-Rite ColorChecker passport. The other thing to look for here in these images is luminosity roll-off, specifically how smooth the transitions are from highlights to midtones to shadows, and how well color is retained. Both images look nice, but for me, there's just something about the Canon image on the right, which appears softer and more natural to my eyes. The Sigma lens on the left has more contrast with brighter highlights and darker shadows. You can clearly see this around her nose and eye on the left side. As for which lens is better from a color perspective, it's a subjective call. You might prefer the cooler and perhaps more accurate look of the Sigma, or you might prefer the warmer look of the Canon. Personally, I prefer the color, contrast, and luminosity in this test of the Canon 32mm. For these portraits, I focused on my daughter's eyes, so let's take a closer look at their relative sharpness. With both lenses, her lashes are nice and sharp. Again, these were shot wide open at f1.4, so the depth of field is razor thin. That's why her eyebrows are a little blurry, but her lashes are in focus. Now for comparison, like we did before, let's look at the eyes from the 15 to 45mm kit lens. The image created by the 15 to 45 at far right isn't nearly as sharp. This continues what I was talking about earlier with low light performance, for noise can have a corrosive effect on detail and sharpness. You can smooth out noise after the fact using an app like Lightroom, but you can't magically add back what's missing. Now let's try photographing a still subject so that shutter speed is no longer a factor and ISO can be set to its minimum value of 100. Both images look great from a distance, but if we zoom in and take a closer look, there's actually a difference. At f1.4, the Sigma lens on the left is softer than the Canon. This was hard to see earlier in my portrait image test, but with a simple subject like this little black and white chimp, we can more easily spot the differences. Pay particular attention to that black line of his nose, which oddly appears to shift in hue towards green. The edges at the top of his head are also blurring into the bokeh background, instead of a nice, clean separation of the foreground subject and that background. The Canon 32mm on the right performs much better. The textures are sharp, and those edges at the top of the chimp's head where the Sigma struggled are clear and well defined. But to be fair to the Sigma, some softness is to be expected at large apertures. So let's try shooting another image, but this time I'm going to include a different lens and camera. I'm going to use the EF-50mm f1.2 mounted on a full-frame 5D Mark IV. This lens, as I mentioned earlier, is essentially the full-frame equivalent of the crop sensors Sigma and Canon lenses on the Canon M50. Here's an image shot using the 50mm EF on the 5D Mark IV. This produces, by the way, in case you didn't notice, a more dramatic bokeh effect because the 5D Mark IV is a full-frame camera and not crop sensor. And now here's how the Sigma and Canon crop sensor lenses compare. Sigma 30mm on the left, Canon 32mm in the middle, and the 50mm EF on the 5D Mark IV on the right. The 50mm at far right is actually softer, where the focal plane shifts from foreground to background, compared to the Canon 32mm and the Sigma 30. In this context, the Sigma 30mm looks great, which is pretty incredible considering the price difference. Overall, both of these lenses are sharp and can produce beautiful images with less noise and low light compared to the 15 to 45mm kit lens, if that's what you're currently shooting with. Of the two, I think the Canon 32mm has a slight edge over the Sigma when it comes to sharpness. Both lenses include large, easy-to-grip focus rings for manual focusing. The ring on the Canon lens is etched into the housing of the lens and turns easily with just the right amount of resistance. The Sigma lens has a larger rubberized grip, which compared to the Canon feels more substantial and easier to use. With autofocusing, both lenses benefit from the M50's dual-pixel autofocus system, so both lenses will do a great job of locking onto a subject. But there is a noticeable difference between these lenses when it comes to focusing speed. First, let's look at the Canon. When I change the focal point back and forth, the lens appears to take its time when focusing. The Canon lens just doesn't seem to be in any particular hurry. The Sigma, on the other hand, is noticeably faster. As soon as I move the focal point, the lens responds and quickly focuses on the subject. Which is not the result I was expecting. With its smaller body, I expected the Canon lens to travel faster, but the larger Sigma lens actually wins this speed test. One last focusing test for those who record video. Some lenses can be rather noisy when focusing, which interferes with onboard microphones. So for this test, I plugged in the Deity VMic D3 Pro and recorded audio of both lenses changing their autofocus. To help you hear the difference, I raised the gain of these recordings 20 decibels. Also, no noise reduction has been applied to either recording, so you can hear the actual files. First, let's listen to the Canon. Okay, now let's listen to the Sigma. Hopefully you can hear the difference. The Canon lens emits a buzzing, humming sound every time the focus element inside the lens moves, and the Deity mic has no trouble picking it up. The Sigma, on the other hand, is very quiet. I mean, you can barely hear anything moving when it focuses. This obviously won't be a problem for you if you are recording audio using a separate device or a wireless mic like the Rode Wireless Go, but it's something to be aware of if you intend to use either one of these lenses for video and plan on recording in-camera audio using an onboard microphone. Before wrapping this up and declaring a winner, I just want to acknowledge that lenses aren't simply about technical specifications and micro qualitative differences. It's also the experience of using them in the real world, as opposed to only using them in a controlled studio environment like this. So with that, I decided to take the lenses out and find a place where I could shoot handheld, indoors, in low light. So I packed everything up, got the family in the car, and we went. Over the course of an afternoon, I split my time between the Sigma and the Canon and captured lots of photos and a few videos. Overall, both lenses were a joy to use. I was able to raise the Canon M50's shutter speed to freeze motion, while at the same time keeping ISO levels down thanks to the large f1.4 maximum aperture in both lenses. The lighting in the bowling alley wasn't the best, but I got surprisingly good results in an environment which can be super challenging for small crop sensor cameras like the Canon M50. So I have to admit, when I first started working on this review, I expected the result to be a toss-up between the Sigma and the Canon, with price being the main differentiator. And for the most part, both are fantastic EF-M prime lenses which have better image quality and sharpness, especially in low light compared to a kit lens like this 15 to 45mm. But for me, the Canon lens is the better buy. It's smaller, lighter, sharper, and with better performance wide open at f1.4 compared to the Sigma 30mm. I also like the slightly warmer color of the Canon, and especially appreciate how it handles highlight and shadow roll-off. Autofocus is faster and much quieter on the Sigma, making it potentially a better choice for video, and it's more affordable. But for me, it's not quite enough to tip the scale in its favor. If the price of the Sigma were to come down to match its siblings, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps then it would be worth buying to save $150. But in my opinion, it's always better to buy the best lenses you can afford. And I think the slightly more expensive Canon 32mm of these two lenses is the better purchase. So what thoughts do you have? Is there anything you've discovered using either one of these lenses I didn't cover in this review? Or do you have any questions? Please jump into the comments section below and leave feedback. By the way, if you're interested in purchasing either the Sigma 30mm or the Canon 32mm, I've added affiliate links for Amazon to the video description below. Purchasing these lenses through those links won't cost you anything more than the regular retail price. I simply receive a tiny little referral credit from Amazon, which goes towards supporting content on this channel. That's it for me. Hope you enjoyed the review. If you did, please remember to give it a thumbs up below. I would appreciate it. I'll see you next time. bye.